Week 5, dissociation and the 5 self-protective responses. Just a heads up for the upcoming quizzes. Remember, in order for you to get your attendance and participation points for the week, email me your responses to the pop quiz questions. Start out with dissociation. So this was a term that was first coined by Pierre Genet back in the late 1800s. And he was the first to really understand and discuss and explore the implications of dissociation, what it means, how it shows up, when it shows up. And he was one of the first to talk about dissociative identity disorder and what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder. Remember, that wasn't a term that was coined until much, much later. He looked at it as a disruption of conscious awareness, and he called it a retraction of the field of consciousness, which I think is a great way to describe what happens. It is something that is different from the freeze response. They have some overlap, but it is different. It's truly a psychological escape and a successful survival strategy in the face of overwhelming attack, whether that's perceived, real or imagined. It's a way for a person to manage something that feels or can be perceived as unmanageable. So dissociation really is multi-leveled in that's a continuum from daydreaming to complete shutdown, a lack of a conscious awareness of what has happened. So what does happen with a person? So when fight or flight doesn't work, freeze is an available option. So remember, this is not a conscious choice. Dissociation oftentimes happens because you perceive that you are not big enough or strong enough to fight. It may be the reality that you're not big enough or strong enough to fight. Escape has essentially become impossible. There is a cascade of opioid-like chemicals which really help the body to deal with what's happening, whether that be an actual physical attack or whether that just be something that's happening to a person on a psychological level. It really helps to, these chemicals help to create a sensation of detachment. So it is an overactivation of the parasympathetic nervous system, which results in lowered metabolic activity. Just a couple brain reminders. So when we look at the different parts of the brain, so neocortex, neomammalian, which is the forebrain, it's that big gray matter part. This has to do with association, symbols, memories, events, and time. It's really about storytelling. It's the area in our brain that kind of pulls together thoughts and creates an analysis and planning. The limbic centers, or the paleomammalian part of the brain, is the midbrain. This is where we find the area centers for motivation and attention and affective memory. Remember, affective meaning the emotions. It is a key area of sensations and feelings. And the reptilian or mammalian part of the brain, the hindbrain, is about physical responses to fear, threat, or stress. This is where really fight or flight lives. This is also where the freeze response lives, which is, like I said before, connected to dissociation. So the perceptions of the environment through the 5 senses land in this area of our brain, which then connects to feedback loops and neurologic connections throughout the rest of the brain. So for your first quiz question, name the 3 main parts of the brain and what each area is responsible from in this context. Oh, I spelled it should be from, not form. So how does dissociation show up? Well, it can show up as distortions in memory or even amnesia. It can show up in ways that the associations about the event can be altered. We as in humans, really want to make things make sense. And so we will create connections where maybe there aren't connections, or we'll try to fill in the blank with things as a way to create continuity, life event continuity. There can be cognitive and emotional features of things like forgetfulness or even absent-mindedness. People will show up with depression, apathy. They may create some disconnection and distance in relationships, and they may even be under-responsive. So they may not display appropriate emotional affect. They may not um, track well with things that are said to them. They may not make a lot of sense in what they're saying, even though they're an intelligent, rational, quote unquote, with it person. When a person is dissociated and they have those features, things can seem really disjointed. So for some physical symptoms, if you think about this, it's related to the parasympathetic nervous system. So it's kind of all of those things that show up with kind of a shutdown, if you will. So there's low energy, exhaustion, numbness. There can be decreased muscle tone, which is, for those of you that are body workers, you will feel this. There can be poor digestion, low heart rate, low blood pressure, and poor immune function as a result of an overactivation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. There can be boundary issues, so their boundaries are probably altered, as would be expected. So they can be excessively guarded, they can have excessively rigid boundaries, or their boundaries can be completely non-existent. Remember what we talked about with some of those, the flexibility in the boundaries, and when a person has been traumatized, oftentimes, again, they're completely rigid or they're non-existent. So trauma truly is a boundary rupture. So trauma most often happens in relationships perpetrated by a person or persons that we know. So the boundary rupture, remember all this, personal boundaries, they're the physical, emotional, and mental limits that we establish to protect ourselves. And these are ways that we will put up as a way to keep ourselves safe. They allow us to separate who we are and what we think and feel from the thoughts and feelings of others. And when we've been traumatized, those boundaries they become excessive or again non-existent. So what's happening physiologically? So on this slide, it really just kind of goes through this little pathway of what happens in different parts of our brain. So we have that sensory input, which then triggers the locus ceruleus, which is our early warning system, and it's located in the brainstem. This also then starts to trigger the amygdala to evaluate content, and this is really geared towards arousal. This area in our brain is also stimulated and triggered by the anterior cingulate gyrus, which modulates the amygdala, and it's located in the limbic system. It's really an important area for bonding and social interaction. And what we talked about last week with when we're attempting to socially engage. So that amygdala gets activated, then the hippocampus is also activated, and this is where we hold on to declarative and cognitive memories. This then in turn triggers the orbitofrontal cortex to organize a response to threat, which then either feeds back into the anterior cingulate gyrus to help modulate the amygdala, either amp it up or lower it down, or it then also interacts, the orbitofrontal cortex also interacts with the cerebral cortex and the HPA axis, then to trigger a response in our system. So here's just kind of a bunch of the words around this. The locus ceruleus is the area that contains a large amount of norepinephrine in our brain. And on the next slide, there are the kind of a visual of the pathways of that. So with those brain structures, like I said, the locus ceruleus is down there in the pons, it's in the midbrain. And you can see that there is the blue line is the dispersal of norepinephrine through and connecting to the different areas of the brain. And you can just take a moment to look at and see all of the different parts that are triggered or in connection with this very, very deep center in our brain. So what we're going to talk about now, what I'm going to talk to you about now is these 5 self-protective responses. This is something that was coined by Dr. Peter Levine to describe stages when presented with a threat. So the first thing that ends up happening is arrest and startle. So you have something come at you, a potentially threatening thing, and automatic response is you kind of take a big deep breath and you maybe even make a little noise like I just did, and it's kind of a shock, right? And you may end up holding your breath, which may continue as excessively shallow breathing. It is a normal, natural response that you do not have conscious awareness of or conscious control over. Your body may get very still, your muscles tense, especially in your head and neck, and you may start to experience some, if this isn't released, if that arrest and startle does not settle down, you may experience pain, tenderness, weakness, excessive tension in your head and neck and shoulders, arms, and hands. The weakness can come after an extreme length of time. So the nervous system moves into a sympathetic state. This is really that arrest and startle as that first kind of response to, again, something threatening coming at you. So the rest and digest part of the parasympathetic nervous system slows down and may even stop. So the next thing that ends up happening is what we call defensive orienting. So this is where we take in as much information as we possibly can as a way to orient to what's coming at us, what's happening. So we use our eyes, we use our hearing, we use our taste may come into play, touch and smell in particular. So the muscles stiffen in order to detect where the threat is coming from. So our eyes will kind of lock on our eyes to see where that threat is or what that threat is. Is it familiar? Is it threatening to me? Do I know who this is? Is it truly a threat? And then we also start looking for the possibility of fighting to defend or protect ourselves, or to flee as a way to defend or protect ourselves. We use our ears to hear, where is the sound coming from? Is it familiar? Was it just a picture falling off the wall, or was it something more than that? And then we can also determine through our hearing, how far away is it? What type of it? Is it moving towards me? Is it moving away from me? We do all of those things. It's just a knee-jerk reaction. It's beyond our consciousness, conscious control, and it again happens automatically. And our nose. So smell is one of our most heightened sense. It is our first cranial nerve, and there is a direct route from our nose into our brainstem, and it is connected to our hippocampus, which triggers memory. The first cranial nerve and our hippocampus actually develop together. So again, we're trying to determine, is it familiar? Where is it coming from? We're kind of using that as a way to orient to whatever it is that we are perceiving as a threat. Then there's mobilization. So we use use of the other responses to determine if this is a viable course of action, right? Getting away. Do I need to fight? Do I need to flee? Can I fight? Can I flee? The big muscle groups of the body move into action. So it's tightening in the shoulders and the arms primarily to fight, tightening in the hips, legs, and feet primarily to get away. So when this is not possible, we will shut down. We'll go into a collapse state, literally and figuratively. There is that dissociation. This is really where this comes into play. And we can play dead, quote unquote, dead, play possum, however it is that you want to look at it. The threat is, we do this when the threat is bigger, stronger, more powerful, when there's nowhere to escape to, even if you could. And again, this is an extreme response of the parasympathetic nervous system. It is truly a conservation of energy. So what can happen that I want to fight or run, but I can't move? So this is, I think I talked about this last week, that what happens is it's almost like If we're going to use a car analogy, it's like one foot is full on floored on the gas and the other foot is full on floored on the brake. And so you have a trapped sensation. You want to move, you want to do something, but you can't. It's not even a choice. You can't. So ideally, what happens is there is completion, and that is equated to success. So when we determine that the level of threat, when we determine that appropriately, we will respond appropriately. We may have successfully fought the threat, we may have successfully fled, we may have shut down, dissociated, or played dead, so to speak, but we survived. So what does this feel like? Well, it feels like that adrenaline rush. Oh my God, yeah. It's pride, it's a sense of accomplishment. Sometimes people want to just, they kind of want to run a little bit or jump or clap or cry, laugh, all of those kinds of things to help kind of dissipate the energy that was built up in that whole previous cycle. So what does this look like? Tears, laughter, fist pumps, high fives, just kind of a celebration. And then the final phase in this is integration. So it's truly an imprint of the success of the event. So we use the senses to determine the threat. Remember, sound, sight, smell, even taste or touch. And we use the muscles to survive the event, either fighting or fleeing. When we are stressed, remember this, when we are stressed, we will revert back to our most successful survival strategy, which may include dissociation. So I want you to list the 5 self-protective responses and name how they may show up physically. However, of course, we can get stuck. So ideally, we move through this arrest and startle, defensive orienting, mobilization, completion, and then that full integration, which then allows us to go back to kind of that resting state where we can then, deal with any other attack or perceived threat that may be coming at us. But when we get stuck, that arrest and startle, again, may end up with shallow breathing. We can end up with digestive issues, primarily constipation. That's what happens when we stay stuck in this arrest and startle. And we may end up being always on alert. If we get stuck in the defensive orienting, we have stiff muscles, primarily of the head and neck, and we're constantly kind of in that defensive stance, either physically or on a mental emotional level. We're kind of always ready to fight or to flee, and we may not mobilize. So then there's difficulty sitting still because we're kind of always detecting that some kind of a threat is coming at us, or we may just like need to just get out of wherever it is that we're at. Again, kind of going back to a lot of that muscle tension and that preparation for fighting or fleeing. And we may have digestive issues that show up primarily in this stage, primarily as diarrhea. So if we're stuck in those other 3 stages, we don't ever follow through into completion. We don't ever go to that integration. And so it can start to cause some issues in our life. And what can end up happening then as a result of being stuck in some of these other states, that's not a good place for us to live. It's not comfortable, it's not healthy. And oftentimes what people end up doing is they start developing strategies in order to manage and to cope with some of these uncomfortable, stuck feelings. So this will show up in addictions, primarily use of chemicals, and food is another one as a way to try to manage and to dissipate or even shut down and block some of the really big feelings that we haven't fully discharged through this whole protective response cycle. Another thing as we just kind of finish up, this is a relatively short presentation, obviously, but there's some things that happen before and after a traumatic event. So resilience is that thing that we have before a traumatic event. So it's the innate ability to bounce back from whatever comes at us. It's something that we're born with. We develop it and we cultivate it. So why or how a person is born with it can be lots of different things. It can be something that is kind of conditioned and supported in our family of origin, in the surroundings, socioeconomic surroundings, through education, and just basic support, religious support, familial support, cultural support. It's those things that we really have that give us that ability to bounce back no matter what comes at us. Then there's this post-traumatic growth. So this really depends on perception about what happens after the event. So it can create some challenges to our core beliefs or ideas, which isn't a bad thing. So post-traumatic growth then can can be a thing that happens when, so we experience a traumatic event, and that may kind of shatter our perceptions of what's going on around us in the world, and it can start us to reevaluate and change some of those beliefs or ideas that we had about the world. Ideally, post-traumatic growth indicates a good thing. Some can get stuck in that the world is a dangerous place and nobody can be trusted. That's not post-traumatic growth. That's being stuck in that defensive response cycle. So ideally, we're open to new experiences. People that are a little bit more extroverted have a tendency to manage trauma coming at them a little bit better than people that tend to be introverted, primarily because a person that is extroverted may seek out others in which to process and share the experience that they have. So adults are a little bit more likely to respond better and develop post-traumatic growth, primarily because adults have the brain capacity, they have the intelligence and the psychology, the lived experience to be able to recognize a, a greater expanse of possibilities. But one of the questions that I have is, what if the trauma is ongoing? For instance, people that live in and with systemic structural racism, for example, that is not a trauma that you then eventually get out of, because it's pervasive. It's a cultural, societal thing. And so there can be, it's not to say that people that live with structural racism and live as in conditions where structural systemic racism is happening, it doesn't mean that they don't have resilience and that they don't have post-traumatic growth. It's quite the opposite. So it's really, it needs to be kind of looked at with a grain of salt, so to speak. But we also need to acknowledge and to recognize that there are populations in the country, in the world, that live with ongoing trauma. Again, it doesn't mean that they don't experience post-traumatic growth. They just experience a different type of growth that can lead to and support their development and cultivation of resilience. So question number 3 is, I want you to then tell me about your resilience. What do you do that indicates to you that you are resilient? And the very last slide here. So a couple interesting videos. This TED Talk video is Nadine Burke-Harris, who is I think that she's the Surgeon General type person in the state of California. One of the things that's really cool about her is that she has implemented that all healthcare providers start screening for ACEs, for the adverse childhood experiences that I talked about last week. And so that is something that is becoming prevalent in the state of California. It's mandatory. And it's starting to also, because of the size of the state of California and the population of California, this is something that's being recognized and mandated in other states. Then the Ray video is a 25-minute video that's done with a man that went first initially to see Dr. Levine. What Dr. Levine has done in the past is that he has had participants in the somatic experiencing training bring in, or in consultation, bring in a client and for Dr. Levine to work with. And so this video is about that initial encounter. And Dr. Levine was so taken with what had happened with Ray that he continued to see him for a couple of years after that initial event. And that's what this video is about. This is just a short 25-minute video, but it's pretty compelling. So again, they're not required, but I do encourage you to watch them.